When I walked into the conference room at 8:30 a.m., I immediately noticed something strange. There was no chair for me. The long, polished table was surrounded by leather seats, each occupied by younger managers scrolling on their phones. In the middle of the room, only one chair sat empty, and it wasn't mine. It was Adrian Cole's. The absence of my seat told me everything before a single word was spoken, but I stood there, holding the folder of compliance reports I had prepared, still expecting logic to prevail. Instead, when Adrian entered, tall, confident, every eye turned toward him as though the room belonged to him alone. He glanced at me, standing awkwardly without a chair, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a smirk. "Elodie," he said smoothly, "we're doing you a favor." A favor. That was how he described erasing 32 years of my life in one sentence. The words hit like a slap, the kind you don't see coming. I forced myself not to flinch, but inside, the humiliation was deafening. In that silence, I realized something important. No company has the right to own every piece of us. We still have control over the small choices that keep us whole, like sitting down with a notebook at night to write one thing we're grateful for. Reminding ourselves our worth can't be measured by a paycheck. So tell me, where are you watching from? And if you've ever felt invisible after years of giving your all, tap the like button and subscribe. I'd be honored to know I'm not alone. I had built my career from nothing. As Director of Regulatory Records, my job was never glamorous but always essential. I had caught mistakes that could have cost the company millions in fines. I had worked late into the night while my children ate dinner without me, convinced that protecting this company was worth the sacrifices. I was loyal, precise, the one who never let contracts slip through with errors. My hands had kept the company safe for decades. And yet, here stood Adrian Cole, 40-something, with a tailored suit and a resume padded by investor connections. He talked about modernization and youthful energy, as if experience were a burden. His rise was fast, fueled by charm and risk-taking. My years of diligence meant nothing beside his polished smile. The contrast between us was brutal. I represented the foundation. He represented the facade. Around us, the HR assistant quietly tapped a button, recording the meeting for protocol. Adrian never noticed. He believed his words made him untouchable. He didn't realize those same words, a favor, would one day echo in a courtroom, no longer a smirk, but the evidence that would cost him everything. I walked out of that conference room with my box of belongings pressed tight against my chest. The sting of Adrian's words still echoing in my ears. The air in the hallway felt heavier than usual, as though every fluorescent light above was shining down only on me, exposing my shame. Yet with every step, another feeling crept in alongside the bitterness, an undeniable thread of pride that no one could take away. I had started here 3 decades ago, barely 20, answering phones and filing compliance forms in the basement office that smelled of old paper and coffee gone cold. My job then was simple: make sure the right documents ended up in the right cabinets. But I noticed the mistakes others overlooked: dates that didn't match, signatures that were missing, fine print that could have cost millions if regulators ever noticed. My eye for detail became my lifeline, and slowly, my reputation grew. By my mid-30s, I was leading small teams, teaching them the same discipline that had carried me, when a massive contract nearly collapsed because of a missing clause. It was me who spotted the error and saved the company from what would have been a public disaster. No one remembers the late nights, the phone calls with lawyers, the weekends sacrificed, but I do. They became the bricks of my career, one after another, until I earned the title of Director of Regulatory Records. I was proud, but the cost was steep. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, and even my daughter's wedding. I still remember sitting in that office at 7:00 p.m., reviewing audit logs while my family gathered at the reception without me. My husband sent a photo of her walking down the aisle, and though I smiled through tears, I told myself duty mattered more. At the time, I believed the company was our second family. They told us that often enough. We repeated it until it felt true. But now, carrying my box past familiar walls, I saw how fragile those promises really were. That was when my eyes caught a frame still hanging in the hallway, my own face, smiling under the words, Employee of the Year. It was dated 15 years ago, back when executives shook my hand and told me they couldn't imagine the company without me. The plaque glimmered under the light, mocking and comforting all at once. For a moment, my chest swelled with quiet pride. I had earned that frame. No careless CEO could erase 32 years of precision, of protecting the company from its own recklessness. Yet bitterness immediately followed, sharp and cutting. They had called me family, but in the end, family doesn't throw you out and call it a favor. I turned away from the photo, clutching my box tighter. That frame might have stayed on the wall, but I was the one walking out, invisible in the place I had once helped hold together. The humiliation of that morning still clung to me as I sat alone at my kitchen table. The faint smell of burnt coffee in the air. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from fury I dared not show in that glass-walled conference room. I had stood silent when Adrian Cole called my firing a favor. I had walked out quietly, but beneath the calm surface, anger burned like a steady flame. Adrian had only been CEO for 8 months, yet he carried himself like a man who had reinvented the company from the ground up. He loved words like innovation, modernization, and most of all, youth. He believed in fresh faces, slick presentations, and resumes sprinkled with buzzwords. To him, experience was not wisdom, it was baggage. Every decision he made screamed that message louder. The older staff were shuffled aside, stripped of projects, replaced by employees who knew how to smile for LinkedIn photos, but had never survived a regulatory audit. I had sat in meetings where he dismissed decades of accumulated knowledge with a wave of his hand. "We need to look younger," he once said, staring at the marketing materials as though the age of the employees mattered more than the accuracy of the contracts. He praised appearance over substance, energy over expertise. And when his gaze fell on me, I knew exactly what he saw: someone who had given too many years, someone he thought had nothing left to contribute. The anger threatened to spill out, but I kept it buried. I had learned long ago that rage wasted in the open is easily dismissed. What mattered was control, turning every sting into fuel, every insult into quiet resolve. It was later that week, scrolling through industry news, that I stumbled upon a video clip of Adrian speaking at a business forum. At first, I almost skipped it. I didn't need to hear more of his voice. But then the headline caught me: Future of Work, Building Leaner, Younger Teams. Against my better judgment, I clicked. There he was, standing on a stage, microphone in hand, smiling at the audience as though he were some visionary. And then he said it. "Employees over 50 are an unnecessary cost. They slow us down. The future doesn't have room for them." The words froze me. For years I had believed the company's mantra about loyalty and family. But there, in public, Adrian had reduced 30-plus years of service into nothing more than a liability line on a budget sheet. My jaw tightened. My pulse quickened. The fury rose so high I could taste it. Yet I stayed silent, saving the anger for the moment it would matter most. That clip wasn't just arrogance, it was evidence. He thought he was untouchable, but I knew better. Sometimes the words of the powerful are the very rope they use to hang themselves. I carried the cardboard box in my arms like a shield, though it did little to protect me from the stares. Or worse, the way people avoided looking at me at all. My desk, once piled with carefully labeled files and neat rows of binders, was stripped bare in minutes. Years of service reduced to a handful of framed photos, a coffee mug my daughter had given me, and a paperweight engraved with the company's motto, "Loyalty builds legacy." The irony stung so sharply, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing or crying. As I walked down the aisle between desks, I noticed how quickly the younger staff lowered their eyes to their screens. They typed furiously, as if the sound of their keyboards could drown out my quiet exit. Some shifted uncomfortably, and a few glanced at me with pity, but none dared speak. To acknowledge me would mean acknowledging their own fear, that one day the same thing could happen to them. The office itself seemed louder than usual. I caught fragments of conversations about new energy and fresh vision. Posters had already gone up announcing Adrian's new initiative, Project Renewal, plastered with stock images of smiling 20-somethings. My presence, clutching a worn box of memories, was the unwelcome reminder that renewal had a price. At the elevator, I paused to adjust my grip. That was when I heard a voice, barely above a whisper. "Elodie, keep the recording." I turned my head just enough to see one of the HR assistants, a young woman with worried eyes, pretending to shuffle papers. My chest tightened. She couldn't meet my gaze, but her words landed like a secret lifeline. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside. The polished walls reflected a distorted version of myself. Tired eyes, stooped shoulders, lips pressed in a thin line. I had walked into this building thousands of times, usually with a folder under my arm and a checklist in my hand. Today, I left it stripped of meaning, carrying nothing but remnants. The drive home felt endless. Suburban streets blurred past as I replayed Adrian's smirk, the word favor slicing again and again. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to return emails or review contracts. I just gripped the steering wheel, hollowed out by a silence that felt heavier than any deadline. When I opened the front door, my husband was waiting. He didn't ask what happened. He read it in my face. I set the box down on the kitchen counter, and the sound echoed too loudly in the quiet house. For a moment, I couldn't move. He wrapped his arms around me, steady and warm, and whispered, "You spent your whole life protecting that company. Now it's time to protect yourself." The words broke through the numbness. I wanted to believe him, but humiliation still clung to me, wrapping tighter than any embrace. I was no longer Director Ross. I was just Elodie, standing in her own kitchen with 32 years packed into a box. The box still sat on my kitchen counter the next morning, untouched. I hadn't had the strength to open it, to look again at the paperweight with the company's hollow motto or the faded photos of office holiday parties. Every time I glanced at it, humiliation returned like a tide I couldn't hold back. But beneath the ache, something else stirred, an urge to fight, faint but persistent, like the first crack of light breaking through heavy clouds. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through contacts I hadn't touched in years. That was when I saw his name, Martin Alvarez. I remembered him vividly, a nervous young intern with wide eyes and more questions than answers. He had shadowed me 2 decades ago, fumbling through compliance reports, absorbing every lesson I drilled into him. I had told him then, "Attention to detail will keep you alive in this industry." He had smiled shyly, promising not to forget. My thumb hovered, uncertain. What could I even say? But then I pressed call. The ring barely sounded twice before a familiar voice answered. "Elodie, is that really you?" Hearing my name spoken with warmth startled me. My throat tightened. "Martin," I managed. "I need your help," I explained in measured tones, though anger threatened to spill out with every word. Adrian's smirk, the word favor, the silent stares as I carried out my box, the years discarded as though they meant nothing. I expected hesitation, maybe even polite regret. But instead, Martin's voice grew firm. "Say no more. I'll take your case." The conviction in his tone lit something inside me. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since that meeting, I felt the weight in my chest ease just slightly. This wasn't just a conversation. It was the first step back from invisibility. Then Martin paused, his tone shifting. "You should know something, Elodie. Years ago, I applied for a permanent role at that company. HR told me I was not a cultural fit." I blinked, stunned. "They used that line on you too?" "Yes. It was the neat way they got rid of anyone who didn't match the image they wanted to project. You weren't imagining it. They've been doing this for years." His words didn't just comfort me. They validated every suspicion I had buried. It wasn't paranoia. It was a pattern. And now, with Martin on my side, I wasn't alone in exposing it. When I hung up, I stared at the box again. For the first time, it didn't look like a coffin for my career. It looked like evidence waiting to be unpacked. Hope, fragile but undeniable, had returned. The call with Martin replayed in my mind long after we hung up. His certainty had lit a fire I hadn't felt in years. Humiliation still lingered, but now it was layered with something sharper: resolve. If Adrian Cole thought I would disappear quietly, he had underestimated the habits I had built over 3 decades. I was a keeper of records, and records tell the truth long after words fade. That night, I carried the box from the kitchen into my study. I set aside the photos and the paperweight, leaving only the files, thumb drives, and binders I had collected over the years. I had never intended to hoard evidence. I simply couldn't let details vanish. Every audit, every HR summary, every exit interview I touched, I had made copies, stored backups, kept my own log. Old instincts, once dismissed as obsessive, now became my strongest weapon. I opened my laptop and began sorting. There were exit interviews where seasoned employees described feeling pushed out, reports where performance ratings suddenly dropped without explanation, and notes from meetings that hinted at something more deliberate. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Older employees weren't leaving by choice. They were being quietly erased. The term kept appearing in scattered documents. Project Renewal. At first, it seemed like another empty initiative name, the kind companies invent for internal memos. But as I cross-referenced files, the pieces aligned. Renewal wasn't about innovation or growth. It was a systematic purge. My pulse quickened as I opened a folder marked HR Strategy Confidential. There, buried between spreadsheets and retention graphs, sat the proof: an email from the head of HR, dated 3 years ago, with one chilling line: target reduction, 60% of workforce over age 50 by end of fiscal year. I leaned back in my chair, gripping the armrests as the words sank in. 60%, not a coincidence, not a misunderstanding, an order. The anger surged, but this time it didn't overwhelm me. It hardened into focus. They had turned loyalty into liability, experience into expense, and they had been arrogant enough to put it in writing. I thought of Martin, of his rejection for being not a cultural fit. I thought of colleagues who had vanished one by one, their desks emptied overnight, their names fading from company directories. Now I knew the truth. They weren't accidents of business. They were casualties of a policy. Closing the laptop, I stacked the files neatly. The box on my desk no longer felt like the weight of loss. It was ammunition, precise and undeniable, for the first time since Adrian's smirk. I wasn't powerless. I whispered aloud to the empty room, steady and certain. Let them call it a favor, I'll call it evidence. The stack of files on my desk had grown into a fortress of truth. But truth alone was not enough. It needed to be shaped, sharpened, and delivered with precision. That was where Martin came in. Within a week, He had assembled a small team of legal minds who specialized in labor law. They crowded into his modest office, poring over the evidence I had collected. Their eyes widened as each document was passed around, every line confirming the quiet war the company had waged against its older employees. For the first time since my dismissal, I no longer felt like a discarded relic. I felt like an architect again. Except this time, I wasn't building compliance systems. I was building a case. Martin leaned across the table, tapping the damning email from HR with his pen. "This," he said, "isn't just negligence. It's intent. They didn't just discriminate. They planned it." His words steadied me like anchor lines in a storm. Then came an unexpected ripple of support. A young woman named Claire, no older than 26, walked into the office clutching a folder of her own. Her hands shook, but her eyes held determination. "I want to testify," she said. "My father worked there for 27 years. They told him he was slowing the team down. He came home crushed. 2 months later, he was gone. He never recovered." Her voice broke, but she continued. "They did the same to you, didn't they? Someone has to stand up to them." The room fell silent, and I felt a swell of something I hadn't known in weeks. Validation. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was the fight of every name erased from company rosters, every life reduced to a line on a spreadsheet. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're braver than you know, Claire. Your father deserved better. We all did." As the team pressed forward, another piece of evidence surfaced that made my pulse quicken. A payroll document had been leaked. Anonymous, unsigned, but clearly authentic. It showed a breakdown of healthcare costs, neatly color-coded by age bracket. Beside the figures was a single note scrawled in bold. "Justify renewal. Older staff, higher expense." The implication was undeniable. They had used medical costs as the hidden rationale to cloak their campaign of youth. What Adrian called modernization was nothing more than arithmetic cruelty, reducing human beings to liabilities. But instead of despair, I felt strength. Every file, every testimony, every whisper of truth layered onto the foundation we were building. What began as humiliation now became fuel, channeled into purpose. I was no longer silent, no longer the woman standing without a chair at the end of the table. I was prepared, steady, and, most of all, ready to be heard. For the first time in weeks, I walked out of Martin's office with my shoulders straight, my chin lifted. Confidence had returned, not from blind faith, but from evidence, allies, and the undeniable clarity of justice on our side. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a place where reputations were either upheld or dismantled. I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped so tightly that the tips of my fingers ached. Martin leaned toward me, whispering reassurance, but even his calm presence couldn't steady the pounding in my chest. This was no longer about files, binders, or quiet conversations behind closed doors. This was public, and it would decide whether 32 years of my life meant something or nothing. Adrian Cole walked in with his usual swagger, adjusting his cufflinks as if he were stepping into a boardroom rather than a court of law. His smile stretched wide when he caught sight of me. To him, this was still a game. I saw the way he joked with his attorneys, the dismissive wave of his hand as though the entire proceeding was beneath him. He believed money and charm would bury the truth. The judge called the session to order, and Martin stood to present the first pieces of evidence. He moved methodically, introducing documents, setting the stage, but then came the moment we had been waiting for. The video recording. The screen flickered, and there it was, Adrian leaning back in his chair, my box of belongings barely visible at the edge of the frame. His voice rang out clear. "We're doing you a favor." The words sliced through the silence of the courtroom. I watched faces shift in the jury box, eyebrows raised, lips pressed thin. Yet as the defense began their counter-arguments, my pulse stumbled. They argued the clip was taken out of context. They claimed it was part of a broader conversation about retirement benefits. Then, to my growing dread, the judge sided with them on several motions, striking a handful of our supporting documents as not directly relevant. Each gavel strike felt like a nail sealing the lid of my case. My throat went dry, and for the first time, doubt clawed its way in. What if this really was hopeless? I stared down at my hands, remembering the humiliation of that empty chair in the conference room. My body felt heavy, as if history was about to repeat itself. Me, silenced, invisible, erased. And then it happened. A juror, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, shifted forward abruptly. He raised his hand and addressed the court. "Excuse me, Your Honor," he said, voice steady. "Can we replay the part where he says, 'favor'? I want clarity on what exactly was meant by that word." The room froze. Even the judge blinked in surprise. The defense stiffened. Martin glanced at me, eyes sparking with renewed fire. The clip replayed, Adrian's smirk larger than life, his tone dripping with condescension. This time, the word favor hung heavier, sharper, impossible to dismiss. My heart raced, but not from fear. For the first time that day, anticipation stirred inside me. The tide was shifting, one careful question at a time. The juror's request had shifted the room, but what followed was a storm that tested every nerve I had left. Martin began laying out the HR data piece by piece, each document projected for the jury to see. Exit interviews, age distribution charts, and sudden drops in performance reviews all pointed to the same chilling conclusion. Older employees weren't leaving by choice. They were being methodically cut out, one by one. Witnesses took the stand. A former supervisor described being pressured to reframe evaluations of staff over 50. Another recalled closed-door meetings, where words like fresh blood and renewal replaced discussions about skill and loyalty. My pulse hammered as their voices filled the courtroom. With every testimony, I felt both vindicated and weighed down. The truth was emerging, but Adrian's gaze, cold and unwavering, never left me. When he finally took the stand, his confidence oozed as usual. He spoke about efficiency, about positioning the company for the future. He claimed phrases like project renewal were misunderstood. His tone was calm, his smile steady. For a moment, I feared the jury might buy it. Then came the slip. His own attorney, eager to reinforce the modernization narrative, leaned too far. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, "the company needed to appear younger to impress investors. That's what renewal was about." The words dropped like a grenade. Silence rippled across the courtroom, followed by a collective shift of attention toward the jury box. Adrian's head snapped toward his lawyer, eyes blazing, but the damage was done. No explanation could pull those words back. I felt my breath catch. This wasn't just opinion, it was confession. Martin's pen scratched across his notes like a blade carving into stone. The jurors exchanged glances, their skepticism sharpening into something harder, more certain. During the recess that followed, whispers filled the halls. Reporters rushed out with phones pressed to their ears. By the time I stepped into the corridor, the headline was already spreading across news sites. Company lawyer admits, older workers cut to impress investors. I leaned against the cool marble wall, my chest tight. The tension hadn't released. It had shifted. For years. I had carried the shame of being dismissed as obsolete. Now, the shame was no longer mine. It belonged to them, and the world was watching. The air inside the courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge prepared to read the verdict. My palms were damp against the wooden table, though I sat perfectly still, refusing to give Adrian the satisfaction of seeing me falter. Martin's voice echoed in my memory. "We've built this case brick by brick. Trust it to stand." When the words finally came, they landed with the weight of history. The court orders the company to pay damages totaling $77.4 million. For a heartbeat. Silence. Then the murmurs erupted. Adrian's face drained of color, his mouth opening but no sound escaping, his carefully polished image, his smug confidence, shattered in an instant. He stared at the floor, frozen, as if refusing to accept that his empire had been undone by his own arrogance. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my hands in victory. Instead, I leaned forward just enough for my voice to carry, repeating the words he once used to dismiss me. "Thank you for that." Reporters scrambled, cameras flashing, pens scratching. Already, I could hear the rustle of breaking news spreading beyond the walls of this courthouse. Later, I would learn the headline that swept across every outlet: CEO's favor cost $77.4 million. But the true victory came not from the money, nor the headlines. It came as I stepped into the hallway and felt my daughter's arms wrap tightly around me. Her eyes glistened, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Finally!" They saw what we always knew. I pressed my forehead against hers, overwhelmed not by triumph, but by the return of something I thought I had lost forever: my dignity. For 32 years. I had carried the company on my shoulders, only to be discarded as unnecessary. Today, the world had witnessed the truth. My worth could not be erased. I walked out of the courthouse lighter than I had entered, not because I had won a fortune, but because I had reclaimed my name. Sometimes victory isn't about money. It's about proving that loyalty, experience, and dignity still matter. If you've ever fought to reclaim your worth, you know the power of standing tall when others expect you to fall. Tell me, where are you watching from? And if you believe dignity is priceless, leave a comment, tap like, share this story, and subscribe, because your voice deserves to be heard too.